So when the opportunity came along to be involved with Star Wars, and it's a big franchise to get involved with anyway, for anybody at whatever level, writer, actor, prop maker, whatever. What were your initial thoughts when this came across your desk?
Well, it was an audition process at first. You know, my very first thought, you know, was I was really wondering what they were looking for.
Yeah.
And you know, I didn't know if I was supposed to just take John's arrangements and kind of fit them in places, because that had been done in other projects like Harry Potter or whatever. Or, you know, I really didn't know. So they flew me up to Skywalker Ranch, which is, you know, I don't know, 300 miles north of me. And I met with Dave Filoni, and he gave me a clearer idea. One of the things that he told me was that George Lucas wasn't really looking for that, what I just described. He was looking to move the sound forward, but still keep the flavor of it. So, you know, after there's this kind of, you know, I've been asked so many times, you know, what it was like meeting with George and stuff. And I mean, it's really good. I've thought about it for so long. I mean, it was really, you know, it was terrifying in a way, but it was also exhilarating. And I always use like a kind of a sports analogy that, you know, I'm a baseball fan. It doesn't help you in England so much, but, you know, sort of like cricket, except more boring, I guess. But, you know, when you're trying to make contact with the ball, if really good hitters, they have to go into kind of a zone and not overthink it.
Yeah.
And, you know, so when I was flying back after my meeting and I knew, you know, I had to do this audition, I mean, that was the really terrifying part, because you can't do anything. I'm stuck on a plane or whatever, you know. Once I got into my studio, I felt a lot more comfortable, and you know, and just like the good, you know, baseball player or whatever it is, I don't think I overthought it. I just went, you know. And I did what I thought it should be. I didn't try to second guess any. I mean, knowing that it was going to move forward, that meant that I could bring my voice into it. I'd already studied John Williams my whole life, really, because I loved his orchestration. I love his melodies. I just love his sound. He's just the most brilliant film composer to ever live. And he's a great hero of all of ours, I think, if you're in this business. So I understood how to get that sound, but I also understood that it needed to move forward. And so, you know, first terror and then exhilaration and then a lot of hard work and a lot of sleepless nights, you know, just cranking through things and finding elements that I thought would work.
So when you get that opportunity and you've met George, you get over the obvious fanish moment of, my God, it's George Lucas, and you're working on, it's a working relationship sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you get back, like I say, you get back to your studio, like George would film bucket loads of stuff and get in the edit room and start crafting it together. Was that kind of how you felt? You're like, well, I know what Star Wars is. I know, like you just said, I know Williams' style. I kind of know the nuts and bolts. Now Kevin Kiner can go and do a Star Wars theme.
Yeah, it was like that. And I still had to use some of the motifs or some of the, you know, the little tricks, the licks that John Williams used to, you know, to keep it in the Star Wars world. But I brought in a lot of percussion initially, and which was kind of I felt a strength of mine. I was, you know, I've been doing that for a long time. One of my other composers I really liked for a long time was James Newton Howard, and he's great with percussion. So, you know, it was just kind of a big combination. And then once you get into the process, I mean, I've watched so many interviews of, you know, composers from everybody from, you know, from Jimmy Page Freddie Mercury or whatever. We don't know where it comes from. You're just kind of in the process and putting things together the way you hear them.
Okay, so when you're in that process, do you still need to be fairly aware of how much, or is there a point where there's too much John Williams potentially? Because obviously there's times when you want to go to those like big themes, but at the same time, what's the risk of overusing those themes?
Yeah, and I mean, again, I tried not to overthink that, but you kind of can't help it in a way. Funny enough, the one part of my audition that George didn't like was when I used the Star Wars theme in a heroic way because Obi-Wan was coming to the rescue. And so lucky I still got the gig, but then it became a working process. It's like, because it wasn't that he didn't like what I'd done with the Star Wars theme. It was he didn't want to use it.
Yeah.
In those kind of situations, he only wanted to use it, the themes in very specific ways. Didn't really want to use the main title theme at all, except for the main title.
Yeah.
So if we used anything, we used the Force theme, and then later on we started using Yoda's theme and things like that. But not that often, in Clone Wars, and that was a big, and that carried. Funny because the movie the music in Clone Wars evolved because it went for 10 or more years that we worked on it, and there was a gap in between. But even towards the end, we really didn't. Like at the end, we don't use the Imperial March when we see Darth Vader. All of a sudden, the very last episode, we are synth based and extremely electronic. When we see Darth Vader, and that was brand new. That hadn't been done in Star Wars, the kind of electronic music.
Well, just looking behind you, obviously plenty of guitars. We're both bass players of varying quality.
Yeah.
Rock feels like it's quite an influence on what you do. Attack of the Clones threw a bit of electric in there. Was that an influence on what you did?
It's an influence on who I am.
Right.
So where I come from, where you take John Williams, he grew up as a jazz and classically trained. He went to Juilliard. He's brilliant in his classical training. I grew up as with Led Zeppelin and Yes, and even I name all these crazy, even Black Sabbath and Uriah Heep and Satellite Brown. I just like kind of sometimes tasteless stuff. Not really Led Zeppelin, but some of it's but I was a rocker. I was just I was in garage bands when I was a kid, and I didn't have that classical training. I didn't have an education at all because I was pre-med, and my mom told me I couldn't be a musician, so I didn't take any music classes at university. Yet I dropped out my senior year. I dropped out and went on the road as music director, and that's when I started learning jazz more. And I'm just self-taught, and I understand classical music really well now. But it's because I've sort of overcompensated for my lack of knowledge. Look right here is. I was reading this yesterday morning. This is the score to Petrushka by Stravinsky, and I'm studying it right now. That's just kind of how I grow and keep myself fresh and stuff. So anyhow, what I'm getting at is the guitar wasn't so much in itself a driving force in my score for Star Wars, but it is part of who I am, and I am like a rocker or whatever you want to say. That's my DNA, and the other stuff I can put on top of that. But where my writing comes from, it comes from my early days.
That's cool, man. That's cool. When it comes to writing kind of themes for main characters like Ahsoka or something like that, when you're like approached about the start of a season, do you have conversations about how the character's going to develop over the season, and then how the music should develop with the character, or is that something that you're just responding to based on the visuals you're seeing?
It's a little bit of both, but we definitely do have conversations. Dave Filoni is a fantastic, I mean, he's just your absolute dream of director, producer, and showrunner, because he's, for a composer, because he's really well versed in music. He grew up going to operas. His father would take him. He understands music really well, and he can speak and converse about it. He's also extremely steeped in the lore of Star Wars. I would say more so than anyone who's ever worked on Star Wars, probably including George. I mean, George Lucas was inventing it, but I think, you know, Dave's knowledge is probably deeper in terms of like the entire canon and stuff like that. Because I mean, George doesn't really like to pay attention to that kind of stuff. He wants to move forward and do other things. Yeah. You know, you know, and so Dave will talk about characters forever. We have spotting sessions where we're deciding where the music goes, and we're deciding, okay, it should be bombastic and big here. This is a big fight scene. Okay, now we're going to take out all the sound effects, and music's going to be really lyrical in this place. You know, we have all these kind of discussions, but I would say we spend 60% of our time talking about other things, not what the music's going to do, not where it's going to go. I mean, we cover all that, but the most time is spent him explaining the whole backstory of what Ahsoka is going through.
Gotcha.
I can give you an example, which I just think is fantastic. Is he talks about Ahsoka making a decision at the end not to kill any clones, even though Order 66 is happening, right?
Yeah.
And this is like a classic Star Wars kind of conflict, inner conflict, and also a classic overcoming. I mean, she's fighting to survive. These clones are trying to kill her. It's only natural if you're, you know, but she will not kill any clones. You know, at least you know, she tries not to. Yeah. And that's a really difficult decision, and it's really deep in the, you know, in the hero's journey and everything like that. I mean, and he explained all of this to us. And when you're infused with that knowledge, it's really electrifying. You know, it gives you all kinds of insights into how you're going to write for that character.
So as a composer then, starting off on that, you know, what became the movie, and then working your way all the way through to season 7.
Yeah.
When you look back at the breadth of work that you did over the years that you did it, was it 12 years or so?
Yeah.
How do you think back now to where you finished as a composer? I'm speaking about you as a composer, where you finished as a composer compared to where you began. Can you see your own personal progression through the themes that you developed?
Yeah, I really can. And it you know, if you take the very first few episodes and then you take that last episode, say the end of the last episode, which is entirely electronic, you may wonder if it's the same composer. You know what I mean? Now, if you watch all 100 and some episodes all the way through, it's more of a natural evolution, and you know, you might not see it. It's just like your child. You know, you don't maybe see him growing up before your eyes, but when you look back at photographs, you know, you say, oh wow, he's a little tiny kid. So yeah, I see, and it's not so much like I see that I'm a better composer. I mean, I could talk forever about that, because I wrote some things very early on in my career that I really love and I'm very proud of, and it just, you know, I had it, I guess. I also wrote some real crap. So, you know, but anyhow, just that being said, I don't really see that I'm a better composer than when I was, but I definitely grew, and the show grew, and that's fantastic, because we didn't sit on our laurels and take the easy way and just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, why was that last episode, or the last section of that episode, all synth? Was that a a production like budgetary concern, or was it just
No.
creative?
No, it was because it wasn't all synth. Actually, the episode, the last 4 episodes, we had a full orchestra,
right,
in Prague, and in the very beginning of episode 12, we had a choir, a live choir, as well as a full orchestra. So no, it was a creative decision. I would say Dave Filoni drove that harder than anyone.
Gotcha.
And again, you can see how he really, that was his vision, and he's really good with music. I think it's really cool. I mean, I'm super happy with how it turned out.
Yeah.
So you did a certain amount of Clone Wars, then it stopped and we thought it was done for good. Then Rebels comes along. We'll talk about Rebels in a minute, and then you come back to the Clone Wars. So how did that feel? Because you've gone away, you've created another archive of music for other characters in a different era of Star Wars and a different feel, and then come back to the Clone Wars. How was it coming back for that 7th season?
Well, first of all, it was a dream, because you just, when something gets pulled out from under you and you haven't finished, it's really a bummer. But very seldom do things work out that you get to finish what you wanted to finish. And that goes for me as well as anybody on the crew. I mean, we were all really happy to be back into it. Again, we wanted the music to move forward, so I had to go back and listen to what I'd done, because I mean, it was years ago. And I'll tell you a funny story, because I have a really terrible memory. And I co-wrote a show with a really great composer at one time, and we were back in watching the final mix with the producers and the directors on the soundstage and the mixing stage. And there was this really cool cue that went by, and I leaned over to the guy who I co-wrote the show, and we kind of traded off what we were doing. He would do one, I'd do one. We chose early on. And I said to him, hey, that was a really great cue, man. And thinking it was his, and he looks at me, he goes, that's you. and that was only like, maybe 3 weeks had passed.
Wow.
So you can imagine me after years have passed, I'd like forgotten so many things I'd done. So I really went back. I kind of chose what I thought were some like nuggets of things that hadn't been explored very much, and we kind of got away from the initial, because the initial marching orders from George were every planet had its own ethnicity. So the music was extremely ethnic, especially in the first few seasons, for each planet and stuff like that. And we kind of got away from that because we felt we'd almost said everything we could ethnically, and moved it forward. It started bringing electronics in, started going a little closer to what you would call modern film score, things that you hear now in the zeitgeist of action and comic book films and things like that.
So when you're prolific, I mean, you are prolific, when you're writing a lot, it just makes me smile saying you forgot your own cue. Can you be writing so much stuff that sometimes, like you said, well, in that instance you did, but sometimes you must have heard music back that you did back in the 90s, and you're dredging it back because you've written it, it's gone, it's out your fingers and away. It must almost, like you say, feel like somebody else's music at sometimes.
Sometimes it's like listening. I mean, literally when I told my co-writer, I mean, it was like listening to a new score for me.
Did you like it though?
I loved it. Right? Yeah. And, whatever.
So one of the tracks that you released on Spotify from the latest Clone Wars album, the Coruscant Cafe track. I was quite interested by that, because that was that's kind of like diegetic music, isn't it? It's the music they heard in the actual cafe, but it's got a real kind of like it's real kind of 80s kind of vibe about it. It kind of had a real kind of 80s. I don't really know the bands because it's a little bit before my time, but something like the Smiths or the Cure or something like that, Was that like a bit of an Easter egg for you? Was that just, was that?
Yeah, and I co-write with my sons, and I have for about the last 5 or 6 years, and they were quite involved in that part of it, and also, I mean, we were, we also, myself and my sons, we work on Doom Patrol, and we work on Titans, and there is that 80s synth and kind of even 70s synth or whatever it is, those early synthesizers, that kind of influence in those shows, and that was part of for the Coruscant Cafe, is bringing that in.
Yeah, it's really cool, really cool.
So when you get into the end of season 7, obviously there's that overlap with Revenge of the Sith in terms of what's happening on screen, but also you kind of feel it in the music. Was that something you were quite conscious of, because these two things are kind of happening in parallel?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what, and that's where we still had the live orchestra because of that. Yeah, it's Order 66 is happening, and the great thing is that we got to explore Order 66 a lot more than the feature film did, and we had a lot more time to. You look at what's happening to the clones, and some of them are not understanding it. Some of them are just mindlessly, it's. I mean, that in storytelling terms, that's fantastic. Now, I mean, you probably heard that I used exactly the Order 66 music from John Williams with my own orchestration, although it's very close to his orchestration at one of those big moments when there's Order 66. And that's a great example of when we feel it's important to go back and do that and just not even just pay homage, but just do what he did. And it's very seldom. I mean, that's probably happened 3 times, maybe in the, out of 100 hours of music more, Clone Wars, of Star Wars music, we never really did exactly what John Williams did, except that was a big one. So we did.
So obviously Clone Wars was Clone Wars. And then in between the two, you had 4 seasons of Rebels. When that came to your door, as we said earlier, it's a different era. It's completely different characters initially anyway. Certain other characters come in as we play forward. But how did you approach doing Rebels? Did you want to make it feel different? What was your MO for Rebels in that instance?
Well, again, it came from Dave Filoni. So, we had a big creative meeting, and I went up to San Francisco, and we talked about it, and Dave's vision for Rebels, and you can see it in the very first episodes of Rebels, where it was like, let's reboot, we all watched A New Hope again, with a particular emphasis on listening to what the music was doing, and also how much music there was. And there was way less music in New Hope than you think. So part of Rebels was trying, and we're doing this on Bad Batch. I'll give you a little nuggets about Bad Batch when I can. But we're laying out, we're letting it play like a movie, letting it. And when you do that, sometimes you heighten the reality of something happening. When you take out the music and just let the sound effects go for a while. Yeah. So we did that on Rebels. There's a scene. The good example is. There's a scene where they're in the Ghost, I think it is, and they're Kanan is at the gun turrets, whatever. It's very similar to the Millennium Falcon scene when the TIE fighters are they're trying to shoot them, and it's a space battle, but it's extremely similar. It's shot very much the way New Hope was shot, that scene. And I used that John Williams kind of the trombones doing that dun 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 dun, and it's so part of at least for the initial couple of seasons or first season of Rebels was, let's go back and start using a little more John Williams, because we hadn't in Clone Wars at all. So that was from Dave Filoni.
Because it was so much closer to that classic era, I guess it had that vibe and flavor, didn't it?
Yeah, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to do that with the show, and so we did it with the music as well.
That's cool. So and I suppose like when you've got opportunities to actually introduce those original trilogy characters like Yoda, for instance, that's when you can start to really kind of play with John Williams's themes and into kind of twine them with your own compositions.
Yes.
Yeah,
we did that. I think in season 6 of Clone Wars quite a lot. There's that whole Yoda arc. I think it was season 6 or maybe 5. I forget, but there was a very long 4 episode Yoda arc where we used Yoda's theme quite a lot.
Cool.
So when you get a chance to bring, and go back to Rebels, obviously Ahsoka comes into Rebels, and now you've got a character, you've established the musical dialogue for that character, and now you can happily port that across into a completely new environment with new characters. For you as a writer, as a composer, how satisfying was that?
Well, I mean, that was really cool when we first saw Ahsoka. And I talk about, not overthinking things. I was really in danger of that because I was just so, I hadn't written for her for a while. I knew this was a big deal. She was much older, not much older, but I mean, now she's a woman, not a little girl anymore in Rebels. And I mean, it was just like, it was goosebumps when I first saw it. And there's this, when you're really gunning for something, you really want to go, be as big and huge. And, so I had to be really careful not to overdo things, I guess. But I think it turned out really good. And then her battle with Darth Vader, it's really, really cool. Really, really cool. I mean, somebody asked me what my favorite character to compose for was. And my just instantaneous visceral response was Darth Vader. Now, and then I said, but really, I wrote Ahsoka's theme. I think as a fan, Darth Vader was just such an amazing thing when all of a sudden I got to, he came on screen. I was just like the fans were like, oh my God, it's Darth Vader. And so, but really, when it comes down to it, the character that I really love composing for, and because she's kind of mine, is Ahsoka. And there's a great depth to her, and I've written about 3 different themes for her, all of which I consider pretty strong. And I'm really happy with.
A thought occurs to me. You just saying that. Do you think a character, any character, requires just one theme? Because the reason I say that is that you think of Darth Vader, everyone thinks of the Imperial March, but there wasn't an Imperial March in The New Hope. Vader had different music. So do you think certain characters can carry more than one sort of main theme?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's why Ahsoka has, she really has, I mean, if I had to analyze, I would say there's maybe 5 or something like that, elements or different motifs. There's 3 we have Ahsoka's, the main theme that, people know. And then there's this, what I call Ahsoka's victorious theme. And that first plays when she gets on a troop transport in the feature film very early on in Clone Wars. And she's kind of flying above that. I'm really happy with it, Ahsoka. And then there's, I forget what I call the third one. And I'm terrible at humming, so I'm not going to try. But anyhow, you need, because there's different emotions these characters have, and there's different. So I'm very, very big on that.
Cool.
So when you were doing the main score, stepping back to Clone Wars, another thought occurs. Obviously, you want to give the film and the show its own vocabulary, but it's got to have that Star Wars flavor. And that opening title is kind of a reset version of the classic Star Wars theme, but just a little bit different with that percussive element, like you mentioned. How many iterations did you have to work on until you landed on that? Because it's noticeably, obviously Star Wars, but it's not. So how did you have to work it? Was it like, you know, like Williams trying to get the 5 notes for Close Encounters? You have to do different versions until he got there.
Yeah, I had to do a lot of versions of that one. That one was, I mean, that's the toughest thing I've had to do, maybe ever as a composer. I honestly argued with George Lucas, and I'd just been hired by him. You just usually don't argue with your boss when you first get hired.
Yeah.
But I told him, John did this right the first time, and it's one of those. It's almost like from Amadeus. Every note's in its right place. Everything's perfect. You change things. There's no need. I mean, there's just absolutely. It's exactly correct. And for me to start messing with it was very daunting, and it was something I really didn't want to do. But I had to. So, you better, and it was very early on. So, I mean, boy, you're talking about, something you could get fired over really quickly. So I'm sorry. It was, anyhow, I think at best I didn't ruin it, and it would have been so easy. It would have been so easy, and it was. I mean, if you hear some of the early ones that nobody ever will, they're just atrocious. And I kept just coming up against this wall because George wanted a lot of percussion in it, and he wanted the world thing, and he wanted But as soon as you bring a beat into that theme, it just became disco. And it was just so difficult for it not to be disco. And I finally found a solution, which I mean, I can't, it's kind of getting into musical terminology, but I put it into a different time signature. Mm-hmm. I put it into 5/4, and John Williams had it as a march, which when you're doing that with an orchestra, it's one thing, but when you're doing it with percussion to be as a march, well, then it's disco all of a sudden, and it's just terrible. So when you have it in this irregular beat, which actually the melody kind of naturally made me get into the 5/4 anyhow. It fit in nicely. So it was, and I think that's why I didn't ruin it, was because I went rhythmically in a natural way, that the melody actually was kind of going that way anyhow. So and then I hopefully found some good drums, and we had some good percussionists come in, and we did a bunch of stuff. But that was really, really difficult. That was really, really hard.
With all these different kind of worlds you're having to build and stuff, how do you go about just like finding all the different instruments? Is it a case of like looking at a certain country and looking at the instruments, and was there any particular ones which you were kind of really surprised they worked in the way that they did, or were your favorites? Well,
so I was, I say I haven't had any music classes, and I never had a formal education. I constantly am picking guys' brains, and I had this early on. I even went for some private lessons with this guy named Dr. Albert Harris. He was a great orchestrator, and he orchestrated for Johnny Mandel and all kinds of people. And I think he even studied with like Mahler's conductor or something like that. Anyhow, he was a guy I would bring in a score, a full orchestra score, and he would put it transposed. He would put it up on the piano, and he'd just play the whole thing right away, just sight read it. I mean, he was a monster that way.
Yeah.
But one of the things he told me was, don't be afraid to call up your trumpet player. If you're writing something in the middle of the night or whenever it is, and you're like, God, I don't know if a trumpet can do that, because I'm not a trumpet player. So don't be afraid. Just call this guy has spent his whole life with it, So over my career, I've gotten to know my musicians really well, the guys I use, and I call them up and I go, is this playable, or is there a better way to write this, or whatever, And so the same with world music is, Now, these are not people I have exposure to all the time, but we found people like for the Bulgarian women's choir. I found some women who sing in a Bulgarian women's choir, and I hired them. And beforehand, I have conversations on the phone. I mean, I'd listened, I'd gone, and listened to Bulgarian women's choirs and stuff like that. And then, so I started writing something that I thought was, authentic, but then I'd have a phone call and I'm like, hey, I'm thinking of going, yeah, da, 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 and they're like, well, we wouldn't really do it that way.
Yeah.
And then they come in the studio and they lend their expertise to you. And I mean, I think that's really important because, I don't live in Bulgaria and I'm not, and there's so many little nuances. Yeah. So I think it's really important to, collaborate with experts in those kind of situations.
Yeah, that's definitely the key. So when it comes to, how often were you able to record with like a live orchestra then? Was that like a rarity and a treat, or was that something?
No, we always, even at the very beginning, and George was really great because they had a certain music budget, and then he was asking for certain things, and I would meet with him every few weeks early on in Clone Wars, and I just had to tell him I can't do these kind of John Williams kind of licks because the electronics just don't allow me. I've got to have a few more real guys. And so he went to bat and increased the budget and gave us enough. So even, in the thinnest episodes, we at least had, maybe 14 people, live musicians playing. And then we would use tricks. We would triple them up, say we had 6 violins and 2 violas and a cello or 2 cellos. Then they would go back and they would play second violin and second viola and second cello part again over the track. And so really it sounds like a lot more. And, I found some techniques for making it sound pretty big and like a pretty full orchestra all the time.
So now, essentially, you're on a hat trick. You're on your 3rd Star Wars show with Bad Batch coming out. I know we can't talk too much about it, but again, how does this come across your plate? And what were your initial thoughts getting to start off with another show that's kind of back with that end of the Clone Wars era you're pushing on from season 7, essentially?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are certain aspects of the characters. I mean, this is not a secret because they were in the previous show. We've seen some of these characters, who become the Bad Batch. And, they're a little different. They're kind of a ragtag sort of bunch of scoundrels and misfits kind of a thing, and so there's aspects to their character that kind of are driving the music in a certain direction. Yeah. You could think, I mean, well, I think I'll save some of that for later interviews. But I mean, one thing I've shown other people this. This is like a guitar, but it's called a guitar viola, and it's similar to this instrument called a viola da gamba. It's bowed usually. I don't have my bow right now, but so usually you bow this, and it's kind of like a cello. I play this. I don't play it a lot, but on a few cues in Bad Batch, where with just a little bit of atmospheric sounds, and then a vocalist, and it's very raw, very exposed, and so that's something different. Like I said, it's not in a lot, but we're going to release the soundtrack as the episodes go along, and you'll hear that instrument. It'll be one of the releases. I'm already preparing that. I'm stoked because that's you try to really be something new, and and come up with something. And I think like when I played that thing, the track I came up with was really a lot of me in it, and it moves the episode and the show in a new direction.
Does that please you then that those episodes, the music to those episodes is going to be coming out pretty much straight away? Because one thing that a lot of fans wanted when Clone Wars was on was to have access to the music that we never got opportunity to get. And we've had selections of, and season 7 was very well covered, obviously, digitally, but
Yeah.
physical releases and so on and so that must please you no end.
Oh, I mean, that's one of the, I mean, there's so much that's gone wrong with the music business, and I won't talk about that at all. The music business itself, you know, records. Sure. But one of the great things is that, you know, when you have a digital platform, you can release things really quickly, and you can concurrently release them as the episodes come out. And I think it's a really cool thing for fans. It's really satisfying for me that my music is out there, and that I see fans' reactions, which tend to be like really positive. I mean, it's fantastic. It's very, very gratifying.
But as you said, an old kind of rocker, are you really chuffed that you've managed to get some of your music released on vinyl as well?
Oh yeah.
So you got to translate for me from English to English, I guess. Chuffed.
Happy.
Chuffed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Happy. Okay, good.
Yeah.
I actually knew it, but I just had to. I'm extremely chuffed.
Good. Yeah.
See, it just sounds wrong when I say it, doesn't it? I'm very, really pleased. It's a great thing. And, you know, being involved, seeing fans' reactions is really, really fun too. It's really neat.
Do you get the opportunity? Sorry, Mark. Do you get the opportunity to interact with fans often, to be able to talk about it and yeah, because it's a conversation, isn't it? If a fan receives that music in a different way to the way that you write it, but if you get your emotions across and the fan picks up on it in concert with what they're seeing on the screen, then everybody's a winner. Yeah,
you know. So having said that it's really, I mean, gratifying. You know, I'm kind of a hermit. I stay off of social media. I don't, you know, there is a dark and negative aspect of it too, which I haven't been exposed to, mostly because I stay away, you know. And but there have been, you know, instances when, mostly with interviews like this, where, you know, some of the people who interview me are way younger than me or you, and they grew up on my music as being the music of Star Wars, you know, from, you know, they grew up on Clone Wars. So I get that lens, you know, I get to see it through that lens. And I mean, I've had people tell me that they went through some really tough times, and, you know, emotionally, and that both Clone Wars and my music helped them get through it. And that's, I mean, that's crazy. Excuse me 1 second.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very gratifying when you, and I do stay away from too much of the social media aspect, but when you hear that from somebody, it's like, wow, this is really a cool career I have. You know, I get to touch people in a positive way like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're quite wise to actually stay away from social media, to be fair. So, you know,
but I, you know, I will say, I mean, this is, I really take this seriously, and my sons as well, who are co-writing, they're huge fans. I exposed them to Star Wars in a very calculated way. When they were old enough, you know, we watched the videos. They were VHS. My oldest son is 33 now, and so they're huge fans. I took them to the midnight showings of the prequels. Cool. You know, because I've gone to the midnight showings of, you know, the 5 and 6, and so we all have a great love for it and respect for it. We work super hard, and one of our big aims is to never, you know, like I said about the theme, you know, never ruin something, you know, never and never do it wrong, you know. So it's a big task, and it's something we take really seriously, and so far I think we've been very successful.
Just hopping back onto Bad Batch for a moment.
Yeah.
Obviously, you wrote a theme for the Bad Batch for Clone Wars Season 7.
Yeah.
When you did that, I mean, did you have any idea that they were going to create this subsequent series? And does this theme kind of play into what we're going to hear in the new series?
So I can't speak to whether it plays into the new series or not, but I'm trying to remember. I'm sorry, I have a terrible memory. I should call Sean, my oldest son, because he might know if we knew about it. I can't remember if we knew about it. It's a very strong melody, and Sean had a lot to do with that. I'll say that as well. That's one of the great things in working. I mean, you know, we don't really talk about who composes what and stuff like that. And we get feedback from producers, you know, different shows that we do. You know, back when I was doing Hell on Wheels, my youngest son, Dean, was doing a lot of that writing with me. And, you know, I would go to the playback with the producers and they would stop and say, "That is a great frickin' cue." And Dean came with me, and I'm like, well, he did most of that, you know. And it was really, it's very gratifying that I'm not just being a proud dad. That, you know, they really, really are good, and that's borne out with other people's observations, not and blindfold observations, you know.
Are they writing with you on Bad Batch then?
They are.
Cool, yeah.
Yeah, that just reminds me a little bit, Jerry and Joel Goldsmith worked together on some of the Trek scores, and obviously you worked on Enterprise, so you're familiar with the Trek world as well. That must really give you a buzz then to because obviously hopefully they're going to carry on with his career, you know, when you're not, you know, it's setting them up good, isn't it?
It's fantastic. You know, Joel passed away. Joel was one of my best friends. And I mean, it really affected me when he passed away. I talk to Joel all the time, and you know, being the son of Jerry Goldsmith was a lot for him to carry. But he did a great job with it. And I wrote Stargate Sg1 primarily because Joel went and got a movie called the Conqueror, and so he wanted to spend his time on that film. And so I took the episodes of Stargate from him so that he could work on that film. But his relationship with Jerry was a bit different than mine is with my sons. I mean, we're really hands-on with each other. We do work together. We're an actual team. My sons come they reverse commute to their house they grew up in, you know, because I have several studios now that we built on the grounds of my house, and so they come in and they all have their own room, and we go walking back and forth, and you know, listen to what we're doing, and give each other comments. And sometimes I'll add, like my oldest son doesn't play guitar, he's a pianist, and so I'll add a guitar to his tracks. Or my younger son's actually a better guitarist than I am in some aspects, and so he'll add things to my track when I just can't do it.
Well, I'm conscious that it's the morning's cracking on for you, so I do have one final question.
Yeah.
When are you at your happiest? Is it when you're writing? Is it when you crack a nut and you think, I've nailed this? Is it the feedback you get from writing a great piece of music? When are you at your happiest as a composer?
That is a great question. So it used to be the last thing you said. It used to be, somebody described it to me as you bang your head against the wall and it feels so good when you stop. You know, and early on in my career as a composer, God, it was just like giving birth every dang time, and it was so difficult. But I've been doing this, you know, over 35 years now, and it really, that's one of the things I hear it and I execute it quickly. So now I really enjoy the process. I used to also be a terrible procrastinator too, and I'm not anymore. I get up early. I get going as soon as the project comes across my desk, and I'm really happy to do it. I think, you know, there's so many different reasons for that. My boys working with me, they've taken the load off. So I'm not looking at this giant, you know, when you look at a show and it's like, wow, I got 30 minutes of orchestra music due by Friday. Oh my God, what am I going to do? Well, you know, now there's people taking that load off of me where I don't have to do all 30 minutes all myself. So it's more relaxed. So I would say I'm really happy when I'm writing by myself now. I'm really, really happy when I'm writing with my boys and they come up with something that's just amazing, or they take something I've done and they do a cool thing with it. And then it's great when the fans hear it and when it's in the show and it really works. And so I would say all three aspects I'm really enjoying now. And I'm super, super fortunate to be in that situation, I think. That's
brilliant. That's wonderful. Well, thanks for giving us some time today.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. That was a great question. Makes me think about things.
And we'll do this again. Once Bad Batch is out in the world, we'll have to catch up and have a proper chat about it.
I have some good nuggets about that, so we'll have to talk.